Has God ever asked you to do something very big for his name and for his glory? And if so, how did you respond? Were you quick to say, yes, Lord, I am available and I will do whatever it is that you tell me to do? Or were you one who was like, I don't know if you picked the right person, God. Maybe you should check out somebody else and call somebody else to this duty. I don't think I'm up to it. I don't know what your situation is, whether you've been in a situation like that before or not, but there has been somebody in the Bible who's been in that very situation. And the thing that God called him to do was no small thing. And I'm talking about God appearing to Moses and asking him to appear before Pharaoh and telling Pharaoh to let the people go. You can just imagine, all the things that are going through Moses' mind. And we get a glimpse of that, just based on the dialogue that goes on in the text of Scripture in Exodus chapter 3 and 4. And so that's what we're going to start to look at today. And we're going to examine God's purpose in all of this, Moses' response, and God's response to Moses' response. I think that there's a lot of interesting things that you can see from this text. We're probably going to take 2 weeks to do this time and next time. And then, hopefully you'll be able to see just how God operates and what we can learn from this. Because even though a lot of us aren't called to do the same thing that Moses did, obviously, or or things that are of the magnitude that Moses was called to do, I think that there's still some things to glean from. Especially if God calls us to do something that's big, maybe not as big as something that Moses was called to do. If that's the case, then we should definitely be able to take learning and encouragement from what's in the text of Scripture here. So I hope you stay with us. I think we got a lot of good things in store. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures. Okay, so today I'm starting on a new series of episodes for this podcast, and the name of this series is called Childhood Classics. Now, the term Childhood Classics really isn't going to have much meaning to a lot of people if they have come to know Christ at points after they were children. But that doesn't mean that it's not relevant to people who have come to Christ after their childhood, whether they were, in college or later on in adulthood or anything like that. I call them childhood classics because these are, a lot of the stuff that we cover in these series of examinations cover stories that if you grew up in a Christian home, if you were raised in a Christian home and you grew up going to church, and going to children's Sunday school or children's church or things like that, you most likely will have come across these sorts of stories. So we're talking about today, Moses in the burning bush, Noah in the ark, Daniel in the lion's den, David and Goliath, those sorts of things. And I don't say you decide to do childhood classics just for this the heck of it and say, hey, let's just go back and revisit things that we learned as a kid if you were growing up in church. But, not only do we want to maybe reminisce on some of the good stories that we were told as children, but I wanted to go deeper than that, obviously. I want us to go beyond the viewpoint of what we see or what we may have saw as children, if these were stories that were taught to you as little children, and really get down to the nitty-gritty of what the text is trying to communicate to us through these stories. And what we're going to start out with here, with looking at Moses and the burning bush, is going to be a case in point. Hopefully, as we unfold this, you'll see what I mean. And I don't know, everybody's childhood experience, if you grew up in the church, isn't the same. So maybe this wasn't a story that was stressed as much as maybe, what I heard as a kid or maybe what you saw in cartoons or something like that. But, I think a lot of people who grew up as children in the church, were learned about the burning bush, maybe seen storybook pictures of it, and it was something that you became familiar with at a very early age, and so it's all fine and great. We learned about, how God called out to Moses from a burning bush, and how the bush wasn't consumed when it was on fire, and how God said, go to Pharaoh and tell them, let my people go. And because you're dealing with children, I mean, we don't go into the deep nitty gritty of just kind of the things that you can extract from that story. And I'm not saying that it should be that way, because, I mean, you're dealing with children, and I think simplicity is called for in a lot of those cases. But for us as adults, most of us listening to this program who are adults, I want to take those childhood classic stories, and I want to really get in there and just kind of examine just some of the things that we can draw from in things that speak to us in our adulthood and our adult lives now, especially if there are things that we can readily relate to. And like I said, so a lot of you might be able to relate to or identify with Moses, not in an exact form, obviously, but in some way where you felt that God has called you to do something big, or God has called you to do something that initially, just from a quick observational standpoint, you look at it and like, that's intimidating. God, I think you're calling the wrong person to accomplish this task. And so, if that's you, maybe a lot of this will speak to you. I hope it speaks to everybody, whether you're in a similar situation or not. But I want to take some time to really examine this whole thing with Moses and the burning bush. And, and I've just personally for myself, I've kind of found myself being fascinated with Moses lately, not just with this, but with other areas of scripture, because I've actually been going through Exodus a little bit just from my own personal reading. And so there's other things that God has just been revealing to me about his interaction with Moses, and just kind of Moses' heart and attitude, and God's dealing with him, that have really spoken to me in a very significant way. And so maybe that's why I decided to start out this whole series of childhood classics with Moses and the burning bush, because he's fresh on my mind, and God has really been showing me a lot of things about Moses that have just really been impactful to me. And so that's where I'd like to start. And so, like I said, I think this is going to be something that we're going to take a couple of weeks on. We'll probably cover chapter 3 and this time, and then part of chapter 4. So this time what we're looking at here is just kind of the whole outlay, the plan that God lays forth to Moses, where God says, okay, Moses, this is the dealio, this is what's going on. And then the next time looking at chapter 4 and looking at Moses' response, which really what it amounts to are a series of excuses. You kind of get this sense that Moses is trying to talk God out of selecting him for this duty. But as we're going to see next time, it's not so much a matter of God coming down and selecting Moses because God needs Moses. But it's for the simple fact, I believe, that God has a specific purpose for Moses in mind in putting him in this situation, in putting him in this spot. Okay, so we'll talk about that as things unfold, and we'll talk about that aspect of that probably more next time. But this time we're going to look at chapter 3. So here's the idea, just as far as the whole outlay of the series. I don't have a complete list completed yet in my mind of just kind of some of the things that we want to cover. But however many episodes this takes before we move beyond this, I don't know. But my thinking is, after that point, when we reach the end of this series, what I'm probably going to do is probably going to go into and start another book of the Bible. Those of you who have been with Loving the Scriptures for a long time know that couple months ago, it's probably been a couple of months ago, we reached the end of our long study through the book of Acts. So there had been a period of time, couple of years, where we had gone through the book of Acts. And so since the end of that time up until now, we've just kind of been doing some other things here and there. And I've been preparing to just kind of a study of going through another book. It is a New Testament book. It's an epistle, and it's a lot shorter than Acts. So obviously, I mean, if we're talking about an epistle, but yeah, that's my thinking right now. Now, whether that's something that we're going to stick to, or whether I'm going to do some things further down the line after we finish this series, I'm not entirely sure. Okay, so. But that's just kind of the tentative roadmap right now. I had been debating whether with this whole thing of childhood classics, if I wanted to, do one or two after for a little bit, and then kind of look at some other, just kind of do some intermittent things instead of a consecutive sort of flow of childhood classics where I do this one and then next week the other one and then the next week the other one, or that sort of thing. I think I'm just going to go ahead and just go consecutively and just kind of do it all in one series, but God might lead me in another direction, and so if that's the case, then we'll do it another way. The good thing about that is that with this whole series, there, each of the stories are self-contained. So, like, obviously, if we were to look at something like David and Goliath, that's not connected to what we're looking at now with Moses and the burning bush. So, I mean, if we were to pause in the middle of or after a few episodes of the childhood classics thing, it's not going to be that big of a deal because you're not dealing with a consecutive story flow or anything like that. So I feel a little bit more free to do that if I feel the need to do that. But where I stand right now is that we're probably just going to go ahead and just do all of these in consecutive podcasts. So that's the idea that we're looking at here. So, like I said, what I want to do is start out with examining this whole thing of Moses in the burning bush, and one of the things that I was reminded of, I mean, it wasn't something I'm learning for the first time, but I'm reminded of this, is that when this story takes place, and again, this is in Exodus chapter 3, when this takes place, Moses is already a very old man. I don't think that ever really registers immediately in my mind. Moses is 80 years old when this happens. According to Acts chapter 7, when Stephen is giving his discourse in front of the council, he identifies Moses as being 40 years old at the time when he killed the Egyptian that was beating the Hebrew slave. And then he says that 40 years after that was when he had his encounter with God at the burning bush. So do the math. You're dealing with an 80-year-old man here. When this whole thing takes place in Exodus chapter 3, and you see a kind of a fluctuation. I mean, Moses' early life is pretty condensed, really. I mean, in those first couple of chapters of Exodus, from his, just talking about his birth and being kept hidden because during that time Pharaoh wanted all the Hebrew boys that were born to be killed, and but he wanted to let the girls live. That was because the Hebrews kept growing in population, and so the only thing that Pharaoh knew to do was to enslave the people, to kind of keep them in check, because his fear is that they would continue to grow, and then if war broke out between Egypt and its enemies, then the Hebrews would join their enemies and overtake Egypt. And so to prevent that from happening, Pharaoh put them under harsh slave labor. And as we're reading these things in the book of Exodus, this is something that has been going on for a while now. Okay, I mean, and this is something, I mean, we're talking about something that's different, night and day, between what you see at the end of Genesis and at the beginning of Exodus. And the reason why you can see the night and day difference, I mean, Moses in Exodus even lays this out. I mean, obviously, Moses, the one being the writer of Exodus, saying that then another Pharaoh who had no idea about Joseph, who didn't know about Joseph, came to power. So you have this different Pharaoh than the Pharaoh that was around during Joseph's time, who showed kindness to Joseph and his family and everybody else. We're talking about somebody, a Pharaoh of a different caliber, who didn't know anything about Joseph and anything that happened long ago back then, and probably who, even if he did know, probably wouldn't give a hoot. Is the feeling that I get from that. So you have this Pharaoh who is having all of the Hebrew babies being killed, and so when Moses comes on the scene as a little baby, number one, he's born in slavery. And number two, he has to be protected. The Bible says that, his parents saw that he was no ordinary child. I don't know exactly what that means, but I mean, they saw something in him. And of course, if you're familiar with the story in the initial chapters of the book of Exodus, they couldn't keep him hidden any longer, so his mother puts him in a basket and puts him among the reeds in the Nile. Pharaoh's daughter happens to come out to bathe in the Nile River, finds Moses, ends up adopting Moses. So here you go from this baby who's born in slavery to a position where he is in a little bit of a more privileged position, being the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter. Okay. Which means, and you get the impression when you continue to read the narrative in the first couple of chapters of Exodus, that you're dealing with somebody who was on a different plane than all the other Hebrews that were living in Egypt. All the other Hebrews were living in oppression and slavery. Moses was one who was not of that class. Because even as it says, there was a time when Moses came down to observe the oppression that his Hebrew brothers were undergoing. So we're dealing with somebody who's coming from the outside, somebody who's coming from a more privileged position, as Pharaoh's as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Not having to go through all of those things. Now, of course, when Moses kind of gets up close and personal with what's going on with his Hebrew brothers and sisters, as the text goes on to say, what he sees is that he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. And so looking this way and that, probably just looking around to see if anybody was around, he goes and he kills the Egyptian. So he comes to the Hebrew slave's defense, kills the Egyptian, and hides the body. And so this is all secretive. He doesn't think that, this is going to get out. But the next day, when he sees two Hebrews fighting, he goes to break it up, and he says, "Why are you doing this to one another?" And the one who was in the wrong says, "Who made you judge over us? Are you intending to kill me just as you killed the Egyptian?" So obviously, this guy knows what Moses did. And if this guy knows what Moses did, then Moses' reasoning is obviously that other people might know what I did. And even the higher ups and other Egyptians might know what I did. And if that's the case, then I'm in big trouble. So he ran away. And as the text, I believe the text says that Pharaoh actually did go after him, but he escaped. And he went to Midian. And while he was there, he comes across Jethro, who would become his father-in-law, and he marries a woman there and everything. And so, what ends up happening is he spends 40 years in that area. Okay, and when you get to chapter 3 here, what we see as far as Moses is concerned and what he occupies his time doing is keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro. That's what he's doing, and he's probably been doing that for a long, long time. You kind of you get a sense of the longevity that still exists among people that of that day, just as far as how many years they lived. I mean, here we're talking about Moses, who is 80 years old. His father-in-law is still alive. So he's probably a lot older. That's neither here nor there, though. It's just an interesting observation, I guess. But so as you get into chapter 3, that's kind of a rough overview of everything. And now, of course, that's just covers the first couple of chapters of Exodus. What you can do is on your own time, just read those couple of chapters. It'll probably take you no more than 10 minutes to do, to kind of get the backdrop story of what's going on with Moses up to this point. Now that you have this 80-year-old guy keeping watch over the flocks, this is what you have here. So when we get to chapter 3 of Exodus, it says, "Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God." Horeb is just another name for Sinai, which we're familiar with Sinai. That's where the 10 Commandments were given. That's, everything like that. So this is pre-Exodus, they're being there at Sinai. And verse 2, it says, "And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, 'Moses, Moses.' And he said, 'Here I am.'" Okay, so basically, we talk about this whole story of Moses and the burning bush, and really the mention of the burning bush is really just there in those initial verses there that I read. Everything else, really the fact of the bush burning and not being consumed really isn't of any importance anymore to the story. Basically, what we see here, we call this a childhood classic and the whole thing of Moses and the burning bush, but really the burning bush really just plays a small, that detail anyway, plays a small part of the story. The encounter and the dialogue that happens between God and Moses as God speaks to him out of the bush is really what we want to pay attention to. So what we see with the burning bush, basically in its simplest form, the burning bush was an attention getter. It was really a way to get Moses' attention, and boy did it ever. Because it worked, because Moses looked, he saw, first of all, you see a fire, a fire of any sort, I'm sure. A bush that's on fire would get your attention, but what would get even your attention even more is the fact that this bush is up in flames, but it's not burning up. So you have flames that aren't doing anything, and to say the least, needless to say, that's highly, highly unusual. And so this is all orchestrated powerfully by God, all set up by God. God is the one who's doing all of this. And it's to get Moses' attention, and certainly it does. So Moses looks, he sees this bush on fire, and it's not burning up. And he says, so Moses pretty much says, I'm gonna take a closer look at this. That's really the extent of the burning bush part of this story. Okay. So but it's still a classic in the sense that, a lot of us have been made known of it. If you grow up in a Christian home, most likely you've heard of the whole thing of the burning bush and the bush not burning up. But where we want to go, where we want to take our attention, is this dialogue between God and Moses, because there's a lot of things that we can glean from this. It's just interesting what we're going to see and how God is persistent with Moses as it relates to him recruiting Moses to be the person to go before Pharaoh to tell him, let my people go. And so that's what we really want to do. So the bush not burning up, that's something in itself. Now, imagine you come before this bush and you hear this voice coming out saying, Moses, Moses. So there's this voice coming out, and this voice, whoever it is, knows your name and calls you twice, Moses, Moses. Now we're far beyond the singing bush. If you've ever seen the Three Amigos, you might know what I'm referring to at that. We're well beyond the singing bush now. This is something totally different, real, but something that's totally different. And so this voice calls out and calls Moses by name, and Moses, to express his availability, he says, "Here I am." Now, as you go from verse 5 and following, this is what you have here. It says, then he said, do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Now, that whole thing of being afraid to look at God, that was common. And you kind of get the sense of this in a few other places in the previous book, in the book of Genesis. Especially if somebody thinks that they have seen God, and say, I've seen God and I'm alive, because the thought was anybody who looks at God is going to die. And even God gives the sense of this much later in Exodus, after Moses asks God to see if he could see his glory, and God essentially says, I'm not going to let you see my face, because if you see my face, that's bad news. You're just going to be able to get a glimpse of my back. So there's a sense where, like, God in his essence, in his nature, in everything that makes up of who he is and what can be seen as far as light and glory is concerned, is so much of a high impact that regular human beings wouldn't be able to take that input, and that they would just fall over and die. So that was, for people who are of the Jewish culture back at that time, and we're talking about this even before the Israelites were even a nation. That was the idea that they had about God. You can't look at God, and so here Moses is of the same mindset. He's afraid to look at God, and most notably so because God identifies himself. Again, he says, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Now, these are people that Moses would be familiar with. Everything that has happened up through the time that Jacob and his family and everybody came to Egypt after Joseph summoned them. I'm sure you had a lot of storytelling in the generations that followed of all of these things that have happened and taken place in times past. That's kind of how history was done back at that time. Was oral tradition that was spoken from generation to generation. And Moses was probably just as much a recipient of that oral tradition, just as anybody else would. So God saying, I'm the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, Moses has heard of this God before, and he immediately knows, I can't look at this God. So he's afraid to look at this God and look anywhere that he's not supposed to. And that's how he has to know how to, kind of avert his gaze, because he's afraid if he looks, he's going to die. But it's interesting that Moses gets a sense, and God communicates forth to Moses as much the grandness of the place where he is right now because of the presence of God. Because he says, "Take off your sandals, for where you're standing is holy ground." Okay, so just from past information that Moses has about God, and what God himself even says about where he's standing. He says, "Take off your sandals, for where you are standing is holy ground." You get a sense of the bigness of God. This is the God that Moses is dealing with right now is a big deal. God is a big deal. And so, so this whole event, just by the presence of God, is a grand event that's happening. And it's just interesting because, again, like I said, Moses is 80 years old, and this is his first encounter with God in this way. Who says that the excitement of life starts to wind down when you get up to be that age? That certainly wasn't the case for Moses. And for Moses, this is just the beginning of the adventure. If you read through the rest of the Pentateuch, you definitely see how that's the case. Where Moses, as an 80-year-old man, this is just the beginning for him. This is just the beginning. And so, he gets the grandness of God. And so when you read in verse 7 and following, this is how the story continues to unfold. It says, Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of the land, out of that land, to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Okay, now let me just stop right there. That was verses 7 through 9. And so obviously we know that this is something that, as far as the reality, the fact and the reality of the oppression that the Hebrews are going through right now, Moses is obviously aware of that. Now listen, he's seen that 40 years before, because again, according to Stephen in Acts chapter 7, he was 40 years old when he killed that Egyptian. Okay? And so 40 years has passed, and that oppression is still going on. Now, just as a side note, just kind of think, okay, God has seen all this. Is he just now seeing this for the first time? No, I think we know the nature of God and the characteristic of God. We know that this isn't something that's just coming to God's attention. God has been seeing this all along. In fact, God predicted this. God said that this was going to happen, the oppression, the slavery of his people. He said that was going to happen all the way back in the time of Abraham. I believe that's in Genesis chapter 15, if I have my address correct there. So this isn't news to God in the sense of, I'm just learning about this, I'm seeing this, and my people are oppressed. I got to do something about it. So even in the time when Moses was 40 years old, and even the time before then, God has seen all of this, and he's heard their cry. He's seen their oppression. Now, in that long period of time that all of this has been going on, for a few hundred years, I believe, people in that situation might be wondering, what is going on? Does anybody see our oppression? Does anybody see what's going on here? Listen, we might be able to identify with that. If we're going through hard troubles and trials of life and things like that, and we think, does God see what's going on? Does God see, and does he care? I think based on what we see here, we're talking about God seeing an oppressed people. God has not turned away from anything that's happened up to this point. But in God's own sovereignty and God's own timing, at the right time, it is now that God steps in and he's going to intervene, and he's going to use a person, an individual like Moses. Okay? And so, just going back here, just from what I just read there from verses 7 through 9, a lot of what God is telling Moses, if I were to put myself in Moses' sandals right now, and not in Moses' sandals because he was told him to take them off, I guess, not in his sandals because his sandals are off. If I were to jump inside Moses' robe here, if we were to jump in his situation, you know what I mean. I'm just being silly, but if I were to put myself in Moses' place, I would think that a lot of what I'm hearing from God is very comforting because I don't think that Moses walked away from what he saw in Egypt and it not affecting him in some way. It definitely obviously affected him in some way, because he looked at a time when he went down to see what was going on, and he saw an Egyptian beating the heck out of a Hebrew slave. And you have to understand what we're dealing with here. To cause Moses to do what he did is probably, we're dealing with something that he was seeing something that was happening that was very, very severe. We're probably talking about a severe beating, maybe even to a point where Moses was afraid that this Egyptian was going to beat this Hebrew slave to death. And it wouldn't surprise me if stuff like that actually happened at that time. A lot of people, have identified Moses as a murderer, and that what he did to this Egyptian was murder. I really don't think that we're dealing with murder here. If we're dealing with a situation where this Hebrew slave's life was at stake, and this Egyptian was about to kill this slave by beating him to death. Because again, I think we're dealing with a matter of severity here. And it's not really a matter of, we're dealing with the oppressors and the oppressees. It's not like Moses can go to another Egyptian. He can call the police and say, hey, help, they're beating this Hebrew slave and he's going to die. That sort of thing probably isn't going to fly, because the Egyptians are probably going to be like, so there's no other option to save this person's life. And so in defense of this Hebrew slave, Moses comes in and he kills the Hebrew who was beating this slave, who, again, for all we know, he might have been close to dying. Whatever the case, I think what Moses saw was a very severe thing. And so he gets a glimpse of the world that these other Hebrew slaves are living in. Again, something that Moses himself has never had to experience before, having been brought up in the household of Pharaoh's daughter, right? And he's seeing this and he's saying, wow, this is really bad. And then having to become a fugitive himself, he kind of gets an idea of things that have been going on. So as God is laying out this whole thing of, I've heard the cry of my people, I've seen what the Egyptians have done, I would imagine, and of course the text doesn't say, I'm just speculating here, I would imagine that Moses is in a position now where he says, finally something is going to happen. And with the powerful display that he's seeing with God appearing to him in a bush that's burning, that's not being consumed, and with what he's been told probably by oral tradition about this God and who he is, and the promises that he's made and everything like that, you would think, okay, I have confidence that God is able to do something like this. I'm glad you showed up. I'm glad you showed up. So he's seen the suffering of the people, and so it says in verse 8, and I have come down to deliver them out of the land of the Egyptians. Now, the period isn't put there. That would be great all in itself. But the verse goes on to say, to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad, to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So he says, I'm bringing you to a spacious land, and I'm bringing you to a productive land. I'm bringing them to a productive land. So, that's what the whole thing of land flowing with milk and honey, that's just a way of saying it's a productive land. It's a fertile land. It's fertile ground there. So, so it's not only going to be just a rescue out of the land of slavery, but it's a rescue out of the land of slavery and into a land that is super duper awesome. I mean, just to put it mildly. And so Moses is hearing this, and you got to imagine that to Moses, this is great. And again, as it says in verse 9, it says, and now behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Now, here's where it comes to verse 10. Moses may have been inwardly cheering God on and saying, yes, great, finally, God is going to intervene on behalf of these people. Now you get to verse 10, it says, come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Now this whole announcement took a pretty big turn just in that one verse. Because you think, okay, finally God is coming to the rescue, and God is coming to the rescue, but now God says, I have chosen you, and you are going to be the one who is going to take charge of this, and you're going to be the one who is going to go before Pharaoh. That's what he says. He says, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a big task. That is huge. That's no small thing. And Moses gets this. Moses gets it. He gets that he's being called to do something that, it's like, you want me to do what? You want me to do what? And so notice his response. Moses' response in verse 11. It says, But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? Underline that term in your mind. Who am I? Who am I? And really, there are no credentials that Moses can speak of. I mean, he could say that I was the grandson of this Pharaoh, a while back, but that's not going to hold much weight. Because what we're dealing with now, understand, and you get this from later verses, that we're dealing with a different Pharaoh. Not the Pharaoh who had a daughter that raised Moses within the Egyptian household or anything. We're now dealing with a different Pharaoh. Okay? And so, other than the fact that he had been raised by a previous Pharaoh's daughter, really what else does Moses have, just as far as credentials, where he can even gain an audience, a serious audience with Pharaoh? I mean, here you have an ordinary guy. This all seems like familiar territory just from what we've spoken about in the book of Acts about ordinary people. But really, when everything is all said and done, when you're at this spot of the story, Moses is just a regular guy. And he's a guy who's tending sheep. And he's not doing anything glamorous. Now, I don't think that people, I mean, shepherding is okay. But again, like I said, it's not a glamorous position. And really, when you think about it, this just came to me. I mean, when you go back to Genesis, 40-something, I don't remember which chapter it was, but remember one of the things that we learned is that shepherds were an abomination to the Egyptians. And so now you have somebody who is a shepherd who's going to go before Pharaoh and make this demand to let God's people, the Israelites, go. And so he says, who am I? I'm no head of state from somewhere out of country or anything like that. I'm an ordinary guy going up to the king himself, the king of the whole land, who can say, do whatever. His word goes. And we're not dealing with a democracy. We're not dealing with a republic or anything like that. What the king says goes. And we're dealing with a guy who can easily say, off with your head, and it's done. Unquestioning. I mean, so, the question from a human perspective is appropriate, where he says, who am I? Who am I? I'm not anybody. I'm really not anybody. It's an ordinary guy who's being sent to the king himself. And then he's going to start making demands. He's going to start, let my people go. Now, of course, what he is told to say is that this is what the God of Israel says, let my people go. So obviously Moses is being a messenger of God, and he's saying this is what God says, let my people go. But still, at the same time, this is not just a simple request, that's being made here. So this is a big deal. But what you see in verse 12 is amazing. So Moses says, who am I, essentially? In verse 12, this is how God responds. He said, but I will be with you. Now, you could just leave it there, and hopefully that would be enough. That should be enough for any of us when God calls us to do something big. He says, but I will be with you. There's a big difference when God tells you to go and you're off on your own. Good luck with all of that. Big situations or small situations. But here God gives this assurance and said, look, Moses, I will be with you. He says, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Now God says, I'm going to give you a sign here, but notice the sign that he gives. This is going to be the sign that I sent you. That all of you are going to worship me on this mountain. Now notice this. This sign is a sign that happens that will happen after the Exodus. That's the only way that it can happen. The only way that this sign can be made available and can be seen with the eyes is after everything is all said and done. So really what God is calling Moses to do is to step out in faith. And after he takes that step, and after he does everything that God tells him to do, then when everything is all said and done, the sign is going to be made known to him by the fact that when they get to this mountain, they're going to worship God at that mountain. So really, God is calling on Moses to step out in faith with the assurance, He says, God says, Moses, this is a big thing, I understand, but don't fret. You know why? Because I am with you. I will be with you. Okay. Now, if we were called to do something big for God, and let's say that Jesus was here in bodily form, do you think that we'd have more confidence in what God would call us to do if God says, I'm sending Jesus to you, and Jesus is going to be in your presence right then and there, as you go and as you say A, B, C, or D to this dignitary or to this official or to this person here? If Jesus was standing right next to you, do you think you'd be a little bit more confident in what God would tell you to do? I would bet that you would. I mean, I know that I would. Now, Jesus might not be here with you bodily, but he is with you in the person of the Holy Spirit living inside of you, okay? And God's presence is always with you. So even in those situations, again, how well you're able to identify with Moses, just in the fact of being called to do something big in the sight of for God, the fact of the matter is that God may call you to do something, but he doesn't leave you to do it by yourself, because he knows that it's impossible for you to do it by yourself. And so the same message that he has for Moses, I would say, would be the same message that he would have for you, and the same message that he would have for me. Don't worry about it. I will be with you. And man, what a comforting thing that would be to hear those words and saying, look, don't worry about it. I am with you. He says, but I will be with you. Okay. Now, in verses 13 and following, it says, then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. Okay, now let's just pause right there again. Because again, it's no accident that the juxtaposition between this whole thing of I am and the whole thing of the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. That's no accident, the juxtaposition of those things together. So Moses has this question. It says, okay, when I appear before them, and notice it's very interesting that, and you kind of get the sense that Moses is kind of starting to ease his way into trying to figure out a way to weasel out of this here. But it's interesting, though, that his first question isn't, what if Pharaoh doesn't listen to me? His whole thing is, how is Israel? What do I say when I present this to Israel? What are they going to say? You can tell that he's easing his way into this, trying to weasel his way out, because you're gonna see his excuse slash objection later in chapter 4, and we'll get to that next time. But for now, he's just saying, okay, what if they have this question of what is his name? What is his name? And so God says, I am has sent me to you. I am who I am. Okay. That is the covenant God. What we know as Yahweh. It's the same thing. Yahweh. I am who I am. Some say it's I will be who I will be, or whatever. But it's interesting that it's not I was who I was, but it's I am who I am. And I think that's interesting, is because if we're dealing with the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, and along with that designation, we're reminded of the promises that have been made to those three individuals, those three patriarchs. The whole thing of I am who I am indicates that nothing has changed. God continues to be now what he was before. And so the promises that have been laid out to those men is still in play. So identifying himself with the name I am speaks volumes. I would say would speak volumes to the Israelite people as Moses would present this to them. If we're dealing with the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, and now God is calling himself I am, It's like God is saying, I am the God of the present. And presently, as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the promises that have been made to them is something that is present now, because I am a God of the present, just as I was the God of your fathers in the past. So here, it seems like God is magnifying this. Now, this isn't just a one-time thing here, as far as the name that God is identifying himself as. Just as he says there in the middle of verse, was it at 15? This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. Okay, so this is going to be an ongoing thing that God will be remembered by, this name of I am. So now in verse 16, he says, go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. It's interesting, he keeps repeating that, has appeared to me, saying, I have observed. Now, notice, this is what God is saying that Moses should say to the leaders of Israel, the elders of Israel. I have observed you and what has been done to you in Egypt. And listen, verse 17, and I promise that I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. Okay, so listen, God is instructing Moses on what he is going to say to the Israelites. In an indirect way, Moses is being made known the outcome of this whole thing. What God has set forth to accomplish is going to happen. God says this is going to happen, and God says, listen, I promise that this is going to happen. I promise that everything is going to turn out the way that it's supposed to turn out with this. I will bring you out, and I will bring you to the land. Okay? So this whole thing of getting the people out of Egypt, yeah, it's a done deal. It's going to happen. And God says, I promise that this will happen. So as Moses is hearing this, you have to understand that Moses is in a position where he's hearing the outcome, and he's hearing from the instruction of God, as God is giving him instructions, that this will be successful. This will be successful. We are going to get these people out of here. I am going to bring these people out of here. Notice this. As it says, because again, it goes back to, it says, I promise that I will bring you up out. So this is, at the end of the day, Moses is being used by God, but at the end of the day, God is the one who's doing the work, right? So this is all God's deal here. And Moses is one who needs to be available to be used by God to accomplish his purposes, all for his glory, in a venture that God says is going to be successful, and it's sealed with his promise. Now, verse 18, it says, and following, it says, and listen, and this is God to Moses here about the Israelites. It says, and they will listen to your voice, and you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us, and now please let us go a 3 days journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. That was the constant request. Give us a 3 days journey into the wilderness so that we can sacrifice and do all those things. That was the setup. That was the request. That was what was spoken, what was to be spoken to Pharaoh. And what you see spoken to Pharaoh says, let us take a 3 day journey into the wilderness. And I sort of suspect that behind the term 3 days journey, maybe communicating something more than just we take a 3 days journey and then we come back. And I think Pharaoh understood that. He's like, and that's why you have this whole thing of Pharaoh knew that there's something deeper going on here with this request here. But I mean, not getting ahead of myself. That's for later parts of the story that we aren't going to cover, actually. But you go into verse 19, it says, but I know, now listen, this is interesting, but I know, this is God talking, but I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. Verse 20, so I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do in it. After that, he will let you go. Okay, so notice this. Okay. Imagine what this would be like if God didn't say this to Moses ahead of time. God says, this is what you were to say to the Israelites, and you're to go to Pharaoh. It says, let my people go. Let us go take a 3 days journey into the wilderness. And then, Pharaoh says, no, I'm not letting these people go. And Moses is like, dang, man, this has just seemed to be a dead end. How is somebody like me going to give orders to Pharaoh to let God's people go so that they can worship so that they can worship God in the wilderness? How am I going to be able to do that? And so you start losing confidence and everything like that. We have to figure this out on my own. How is this going to happen? All these sorts of questions are swirling in your mind. Before anything even happens, before Moses talks to one single individual on the Egyptian side or even on the Israelite side, God says, I know that Pharaoh is not going to let these people go. And he's not going to let them go unless a strong hand compels him. Now, who's that strong hand belong to? That strong hand belongs to God, which again brings us to the reality that God is the one who's working all things out in the midst of all of this. God is the one who's laying everything out the way that it's supposed to happen. This is all a work of God. And remember that Moses is just an instrument that's being used by God to accomplish his purposes. And really all that we have right now up to this point is an order from God to Moses saying, this is what you are to say. Okay. All of this so far is a matter of words. And we'll get to some actions here when we get into the next chapter, which we'll look at next time. But it's just interesting. God lets Moses in on the whole thing ahead of time. Says Moses, just so you know, Pharaoh is not going to let him go, and a strong and mighty hand is one who's going to have to compel him. So here you're saying there's a setup where Moses doesn't have to go into this situation with the fear of, if I go and I say what God is going to say, I'm going to be a failure if Pharaoh says no. God says, that's okay. Listen, this is what we expect. Pharaoh isn't going to, and he's going to need a strong hand to compel him. Now, listen, it's in verse 20. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do in it. So Moses is going to have a front row seat of seeing all of these things that God is going to be able to do. And if there's anything, so God is even going to say, I'm going to be one who's going to intervene. And I'm going to be doing all these things, by the way, that Moses knows he has no ability to do. It's just all a God thing. So Moses is going to have a chance to be able to see God work. And God is the one who's going to be able to compel Pharaoh with a mighty hand for his purposes to be accomplished. So the point that I'm making here is that there's a continual case that's being built. Maybe I shouldn't word it in that way. It's not like God is trying to convince Moses and building a case. It's not that. God is saying, Moses, it's you. You are one who is going to go. But all these assurances seem to be put in place. I will be with you. You are going to tell the Israelites, I promise that this will happen. And by the way, Moses, ahead of time, you should know that Pharaoh won't let them go. And it's going to take a powerful hand to compel him. So that's what is going to happen. And I'm going to come down and I'm going to show all manner of wonders and power and might among Pharaoh and among his Egyptian cohorts. After that, it says there at the end of verse 20, after that, he will let you go. So there's the guarantee again. This is going to happen. He will let you go. Okay. All of this is going to be successful. You just need to follow my lead. Okay. And if that's not enough, verse 21 to the end of the chapter, and I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And when you go, you shall not go empty. Isn't that great? It would be just one thing to, after being in years of slavery, to get up and to be able to go. Okay. But it's not only just going to be left at that. It's going to be, verse 22, but each woman shall ask of her neighbor and any woman who lives with her in her house, for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing. You shall put them on your sons and on your daughters, so you shall plunder the Egyptians. Okay? So there's their provisions that are going to happen right there, and it's going to be provided for them. And again, God's hand is going to be in the midst of this. So there's the setup. God has laid this all out for Moses and saying, Moses, this is what's going to happen. And I'm selecting you to carry this whole mission out. Now listen, this is a work of me. I'm going to be the one who's ultimately going to be doing the work. But stick by me. Everything's going to work out. I mean, that's just a rough paraphrase of everything that's going on. But I want you to take note again of all those details that I laid out for you of what God is doing. And that's a perfect setup, because we're going to leave it here for now. But next time what we're going to see is we're going to see Moses' response to this as we go into Exodus chapter 4. And as we do that next time, ask yourself this question: is this how I respond to God when God asks me to do something? Even with the assurances that we have from him, from peace from his Holy Spirit, for example, or assurances of what promises he lays out in his word, how do I react to God when he tells me to do something that I am intimidated to do? Okay, we're going to see that Moses is going to try a few things here and there to kind of give excuses as his way of saying, look, God, I think you picked the wrong person. I think you need to choose somebody else. But God is insistent. God is relentless, and God is not going to turn away. And he's not. And it's really interesting how he unfolds this too, how God doesn't turn away, and Moses is going to be a participant of this. He is going to be a participant of this. So we're going to see this whole exchange go down, and I think that we're really going to be able to draw some things from this when we examine this next time. But keep in mind, though, just as we bring our time to a close now, just keep in mind the promises that God has made, and even what he made to Moses, where he says, I will be with you. Don't ever think that God is going to give you a task, something that that he wants you to do for his purposes, and not give you the strength to do it, and not giving you his presence or anything like that in order to accomplish this. Don't ever think that. And listen, this is something that Moses had to be told. Look, I will be with you. And other people in Scripture have been told this too. Joshua, I will be with you, right? Gideon, I believe, I will be with you. I mean, you can have these situations where people are asked to do certain things, and God gives the assurance, I will be with you. We can always bank on the fact that God is with us all the time, whether he asks us to do something big or not. The presence of God is assured all the time. And I want you to take, just to rest in that wonderful truth, that no matter what the situation is, and no matter what God asks you to do, that God is with you all the time. He will never leave you, and he will never forsake you. He was going to be with Moses, and that was that's something that was carried through all throughout the rest of Moses' life, and everything that he had to deal with, even after the Exodus. God was with him. Okay, so we're going to see some interesting things next time. So I hope you come back and join us as we conclude this whole thing of Moses and the burning bush as part of our beginning series of childhood classics. If you like this show, and maybe you've come upon Loving the Scriptures for the first time, or if you've listened for a while and haven't done so already, I would encourage you to subscribe to my show on Apple Podcasts. You can also access Loving the Scriptures on Google Play. Also check out Loving the Scriptures on Twitter and follow me. My handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSCRIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. And if you feel so inclined, you can also reach out to me. Send me a message on Twitter just to say hey. I would really appreciate that as well, and that would be wonderful. I'd like to hear from some of my listeners. So anyway, like I said, we'll leave it there. I hope you enjoyed this time in Scripture. I know that I have. My name is Steve Gill, and I will see you right back here next time. Bye now.